The 1990s didn't have one pop era. They had three. Three completely different rule sets, three completely different ways to win, and three completely different types of artists who came out on top. And the woman who survived all of them, the only one who was dominant across every single phase of this decade, is the one who won. But here's what nobody ever talks about when they rank the 90s. Everyone remembers who was big. Mariah, Whitney, Britney. Those names are obvious. What gets lost is why the rules kept changing underneath them. Because the skills that made you the biggest pop star on the planet in 1991 were completely useless by 1999. The entire definition of what a pop girl was supposed to be got rewritten twice in the space of a single decade. And most of the women we think of as 90s icons, they were only dominant in one of these three windows. Only one artist held the throne across all three. Right. Let me explain how this works. Chapter 1, 1990 to 1993. I'm calling this the vocal arms race. This is the era where the only thing that mattered was the voice. Could you out-sing everyone else in the room? Could you hit the note? Could you carry a ballad that would stop a whole room? If the answer was yes, you were in the conversation. If the answer was no, the door was shut. The barrier to entry was pure, undeniable vocal talent. And three women in particular, Mariah Carey, Whitney Houston, and Janet Jackson, were locked in a battle where every single album had to outsell, out-vocal, and outperform the last. Chapter 2, 1994 to 1997, the global expansion. This is where the American market stops being enough. Suddenly you need the world. You need to be number one in 37 countries, not just on the Billboard Hot 100. This is where Celine Dion sells 32 million copies of a single album, and Alanis Morissette proves a woman with a guitar and some rage can outsell every single polished vocal diva on the planet. And Mariah? She's quietly doing something none of them are. She's evolving. She's moving toward a more overt style of R&B and hip-hop while everyone else is playing it safe. Chapter 3, 1998 to 1999, the changing of the guard. This is where the decade breaks in half. Madonna reinvents herself and proves a pop career can actually last 15 years. Lauryn Hill makes an album so good it wins Album of the Year at the Grammys and then essentially walks away from music. And a 17-year-old from Louisiana named Britney Spears arrives and tears down everything the vocal divas spent a decade building. Suddenly, pop isn't about the voice anymore. It's about the brand, the choreography, the image, the moment. Three eras, three completely different games, and only one woman was a genuine force in all of them. Let's start at the beginning, with the era that built the modern pop diva from the ground up.
These are the circuits of history, gentlemen. They'll take us to any point in time we wish.
To understand why the early 90s became a vocal arms race, you have to understand that by the end of the 1980s, pop music was running on two completely separate tracks, and they were heading in opposite directions. On one track, you had the manufactured side. Paula Abdul was one of the biggest selling female artists of 1989, and with genuine respect to Paula, she'd be the first to tell you. The appeal was choreography, the videos, the personality, and there's nothing wrong with that. The voice was part of the package, but not the point of it. Debbie Gibson and Tiffany were selling millions of records to teenagers, but nobody was calling them generational vocalists. And then you had Milli Vanilli, who won a Grammy and literally weren't singing on their own album. That's where one version of pop was in 1989. Assembled, packaged. The voice was negotiable, but on the other track, something far more ambitious was happening. Janet Jackson released Rhythm Nation 1814 in September 1989, and it wasn't just a pop album, it was a statement of intent that made almost everything else on the charts look small. 7 top 5 singles, 4 number ones, over 12 million copies sold in the US alone. And the content wasn't love songs and dance tracks, it was social commentary, political urgency, and industrial funk wrapped in some of the tightest production pop music had ever heard. Rhythm Nation itself was a song about poverty, violence, and inequality, and it went to number 1 in 1989 on pop radio. What Janet proved with that album is that a pop record by a woman could be conceptually ambitious, politically serious, and commercially dominant, all at the same time. She raised the stakes for what a female pop artist was supposed to deliver. Not just hits, a vision. And that shift in expectations is the direct precursor to everything that happened next. Because once Janet proved the ceiling was that high, 2 other women walked in and raised it even further, specifically on vocal terms. And that's where the arms race truly ignited. Mariah Carey released Vision of Love in May 1990, and even against the backdrop Janet had just set, the impact was seismic. Not just because it went to number 1, a lot of songs went to number 1, but because of what she was doing with her voice on that record. The runs, the whistle register, the sheer technical audacity of it. That single didn't just launch a career, it redrew the blueprint of what a pop vocal was supposed to sound like. Every female vocalist who auditioned for a record deal in the next 5 years was measured against that performance. Janet had raised the bar for ambition and scope. Mariah raised it for pure vocal ability. Her self-titled album went to number 1, then Love Takes Time went to number 1, then Someday, then I Don't Wanna Cry. 4 consecutive number 1s from a debut album by an artist nobody had heard of 12 months earlier. By the time Emotions dropped in 1991 and the title track became her 5th straight number 1, the pattern was clear. Mariah Carey wasn't having a good run. She was rewriting the record books, and she was doing it with her voice as the primary weapon. But she wasn't alone in responding to the new standard. Whitney Houston had been the dominant female vocalist of the late 80s, and she wasn't about to cede that ground to a newcomer. Whitney's response wasn't another album, it was a cultural event. The Bodyguard soundtrack arrived in November 1992 and proceeded to sell 45 million copies worldwide, making it the best-selling soundtrack in history. I Will Always Love You spent 14 weeks at number 1 in the US alone and became arguably the most recognizable vocal performance of the entire decade. One song, that's all it took for Whitney to remind the industry who set the standard in the first place. And what made the competition so compelling is that all 3 of these women were operating on completely different frequencies. Janet was conceptual. The albums were world-building exercises with social and artistic ambition baked into every single track. Mariah was acrobatic. The runs, the whistle notes, the technical fireworks that rewired what pop radio thought a vocal could do. Whitney was the vessel. She didn't write her own material, but it didn't matter because her voice could take a song from a songwriter's notebook and turn it into something that felt like it had always existed. Every note placed with precision, every dynamic shift earned, and then she'd blow the roof off in the final chorus. And Janet wasn't standing still. By 1993, she'd absorbed the vocal escalation happening around her and responded with Janet, period. 14 million copies worldwide. That's The Way Love Goes, at number 1 for 8 weeks. And an album that pushed even further than Rhythm Nation into new territory. Sex, control, vulnerability, self-expression. Janet was a complete artistic statement disguised as a hit machine. She didn't just keep pace with Mariah and Whitney. She expanded the entire definition of what a pop album by a woman was allowed to contain. So here are my year-by-year picks for this era. 1990, Mariah Carey. Debut album, 4 number 1s, complete market disruption. 1991, Mariah Carey. 5th consecutive number 1 with Emotions. 8 million copies of the album sold. 1992, Whitney Houston. The Bodyguard is inescapable. 14 weeks at number 1, 45 million copies. There's really no argument. 1993, Janet Jackson. Janet outsells every female album of the year, dominates the summer, and shifts the cultural conversation. Mariah takes 2, Whitney takes 1, Janet takes 1. And Janet's the only artist in this whole era who was a dominant force before the arms race started and was still pushing boundaries when it peaked. That matters later. But here's the critical thing. This era's logic was already starting to fracture, because while these 3 were locked in battle in the States, the international market was about to explode in a way that would change the rules of pop music completely. The voice alone wasn't going to be enough anymore. You were going to need the world. All except one of them saw that shift coming too late. If the first era of the 90s was about who had the voice, the second era was about who had the world. And the shift happened fast. By 1994, the international music market was transforming. CD sales were booming globally. MTV had launched dedicated channels across Europe and Asia. And for the first time, the American pop landscape, which had operated as the center of gravity for decades, was being challenged by artists whose international sales were dwarfing their domestic numbers. The rules of engagement were changing. It was no longer enough to dominate the Billboard Hot 100 and call yourself the biggest pop star on the planet. You needed Tokyo, you needed London, you needed Sao Paulo, you needed the planet. And this is where Mariah Carey did something that doesn't get talked about enough. Music Box arrived in late 1993, but its commercial life stretched deep into 1994 and beyond. It wasn't just an American success. It sold over 28 million copies worldwide. It went to #1 in countries where Mariah had barely registered before. And the sound of that album, warm, melodic, built around ballads that didn't need a word of English to feel emotional, translated across cultures in a way her earlier, more technically demanding records hadn't quite managed. Now, I bring this up with some personal authority because Music Box was my introduction to Mariah Carey. I was about 11, growing up in a tiny village in the north of England, the kind of place that didn't even have a record store. If you wanted to buy an album, you had to get to the nearest city. The closest I came regularly to the pop music world was watching Top of the Pops on a Friday at 6 p.m. at the youth club. And that's where I first heard Mariah. Without You came on, and something about the clarity of that vocal, the simplicity of that melody cut straight through everything. I didn't know anything about the American chart system. I didn't know about the vocal arms race happening across the Atlantic. I just knew this woman had a voice that stopped the room. And I was hooked from that moment. Over 2 decades of Mariah fandom, and it all started at a youth club in a village that was about as far from the music industry as you can possibly get. That's what the global expansion era did. It took artists who were American chart phenomena, and it made them feel personal to kids in places those artists would never visit. And the scale of that international explosion was staggering. Celine Dion released Falling Into You in 1996 and sold 32 million copies. Alanis Morissette's Jagged Little Pill, which had dropped in 1995, was still selling in enormous volumes years later and finished with 33 million worldwide sales. Shania Twain crossed from country into pop with Come On Over and sold 40 million, making it the best-selling album by a female solo artist of all time. I bought my friend Abigail a copy of Come On Over for Christmas one year. I think it was 1998. It was the album that everyone wanted. You couldn't escape it, and you didn't want to. These aren't pop star numbers. These are infrastructure numbers, figures that reshaped how record labels thought about the ceiling of what a single album could achieve. And then there was Madonna, who was doing something more subtle but equally fascinating. Bedtime Stories came out in 1994, and for me, that album was a revelation for a completely different reason. Madonna was flirting with R&B, working with Babyface and Dallas Austin, and the textures on that record, the smoothness of Take a Bow, the slow burn sophistication of the whole thing sounded like nothing I'd ever heard. At the youth club, surrounded by kids who mostly cared about football, Bedtime Stories sounded impossibly adult, impossibly cool, like a window into a world I was miles away from but desperate to understand. And this is where I want to address something that comes up constantly in the comments section, because Madonna fans, and I say this with love, always want to argue that Mariah was local and Madonna was global. And there's a grain of truth in that. Madonna absolutely had a stronger grip on the UK and mainland Europe markets than Mariah did, especially through most of the 90s. But what that argument always ignores is Asia. Mariah Carey was enormous in Japan. She was a phenomenon across Southeast Asia. Music Box and Daydream sold in volumes across that region that Madonna never matched. So when we talk about global reach in this era, we need to be honest about what we mean. Madonna's global was transatlantic. Mariah's global was genuinely worldwide. And in an era defined by international expansion, that distinction matters because Mariah didn't just survive the global expansion. She set its benchmarks and then kept evolving past them. Daydream dropped in 1995, went diamond in the US, and produced One Sweet Day with Boyz II Men, 16 weeks at #1, breaking the all-time record. Fantasy debuted at #1, the first song by a female artist to ever do that. And then in 1997, while Celine was going bigger and more orchestral, Mariah went in the opposite direction. She released Butterfly and pivoted toward hip-hop. It was darker, more personal, more creatively ambitious. Almost nobody at her commercial level was willing to take that kind of risk, and the fact that she took it at the peak of her sales dominance tells you everything about where her instincts were pointing. My year-by-year picks for this era: 1994, Mariah Carey. Music Box is still selling globally in enormous numbers, and she follows it with Merry Christmas, which will eventually become the best-selling Christmas album of all time. She owns this year on every continent that matters. 1995, Mariah Carey. Daydream goes diamond, One Sweet Day breaks the all-time #1 record at 16 weeks, Fantasy debuts at #1, the first song by a female artist to ever do that. 1996, Celine Dion. 32 million copies of Falling Into You. Because You Loved Me dominates the year. This is the one year in the entire mid-90s where someone matches Mariah's scale, and Celine does it emphatically. 1997, Mariah Carey. Butterfly doesn't quite match Daydream's sales, but Honey debuts at #1, the album goes 5 times platinum in the US, and her creative evolution keeps her ahead of a field where most of her competitors are standing still. That gives Mariah 5 years out of the first 8. 2 from the vocal arms race, 3 from the global expansion. Only Celine managed to break through in 1996, and even that was temporary. Mariah took the throne straight back the following year. And before we move into the final chapter of this decade, I want to take a moment to acknowledge something, because this ranking is built around a very specific question: who is the main pop girl each year? And that means some genuinely extraordinary artists don't get a year to their name. And that doesn't mean they didn't matter. In many cases, they mattered enormously. Aaliyah was quietly redefining what R&B could sound like. Her work with Timbaland on 1 in a Million in 1996 pointed toward a future that the rest of the industry wouldn't catch up to for years. Mary J. Blige was the queen of hip-hop soul, and My Life in 1994 is one of the most emotionally raw albums anyone released in the entire decade. Björk was operating on a completely different planet, making music that didn't fit into any chart conversation but influenced everyone who heard it, including people on this list. Jewel and Sheryl Crow proved singer-songwriters could compete commercially in an era dominated by studio productions. Amy Grant crossed from Christian music into mainstream pop and opened a door that barely existed before her. And Brandy, keep her name in mind because she's going to have moments in the 2000s that we'll absolutely get to. And then there are the groups. TLC, the Spice Girls, Destiny's Child in their earliest form. Groups aren't a part of this series. The main pop girl ranking is solo artists only, but they'll absolutely get their own proper spotlight on this channel very soon. And that's a promise. But the final chapter of the 90s is the one that changes everything, because what's coming in 1998 and 1999 will make vocal talent and album sales feel almost secondary. The game is about to change one more time, and when it does, even Mariah's 5-year reign won't protect her from what comes next. Everything that made the 90s work, the voices, the album sales, the slow burn global rollouts broke apart in 2 years. And it started with the woman everyone had written off. Madonna released Ray of Light in February 1998, and it did something that no pop comeback had ever done before. It made reinvention look like evolution rather than desperation. She'd spent the mid-90s losing ground commercially. Erotica had alienated half her audience, Bedtime Stories was a critical recovery but not a commercial blockbuster, and by 1997 the prevailing wisdom was that Madonna's era was over. The vocal divas had overshadowed her. The new global sellers had outsold her. She was 39 years old in an industry that had never let a female pop artist stay relevant past 35. And then she partnered with William Orbit, immersed herself in electronic music and Kabbalah, and delivered an album that sounded like absolutely nothing else on the charts. Ray of Light, the single, was propulsive, euphoric, and technically unlike anything she'd ever recorded. Frozen was cinematic and strange. The whole album felt like it had arrived from somewhere outside the pop conversation entirely, and the industry responded accordingly. 4 Grammys, critical adoration, and over 16 million copies sold worldwide. What Madonna proved in 1998 is arguably more important than any individual chart record from the entire decade. She proved a pop career could have a second act, a real one, not a nostalgia tour, not a greatest hits repackaging, an actual creative reinvention that made the new generation of artists seem conservative by comparison. That hadn't been done before, not at her level and not at her age. And every pop artist who's reinvented themselves in the 25 years since, Kylie with Fever, Mariah with Mimi, Cher with Believe, is walking through a door that Ray of Light kicked open. And 1998 also produced what many critics consider the single greatest album of the entire decade, full stop. The Miseducation of Lauryn Hill sold over 20 million copies, won 5 Grammys including Album of the Year, and accomplished something the vocal arms race had been circling for 8 years without ever quite reaching. It was a pop album that was also a masterwork of songwriting, production, and emotional honesty. Lauryn Hill didn't just compete with the divas. She transcended the entire framework they were operating in. And then she essentially walked away from music, all except for an MTV Unplugged double album a few years later, which is a whole other conversation. But in the context of this ranking, it means 1998 gave us 2 seismic artistic achievements, Ray of Light and Miseducation, from 2 very different artists who for very different reasons would never repeat them. And then January 1999, a 17-year-old from Kentwood, Louisiana, releases her debut single, and the entire architecture of 90s pop collapses overnight. Baby One More Time didn't just go to #1, it announced a completely new set of rules. The voice wasn't the point. Britney could sing, don't get me wrong, but nobody was comparing her to Mariah or Whitney, and it didn't matter. The songwriting wasn't the point. Max Martin wrote the song, and that was fine, because authorship wasn't the currency anymore. What mattered was the image, the choreography, the video, the cultural moment. I do want to stop here and just, as an aside, Madonna is often thought of as the mother of Britney, and I don't think that's the case. I personally think that Britney is more of a child of Janet than she is of Madonna. Madonna might have swept in and claimed her years later with Me Against the Music and that incredible MTV VMA performance, but Britney is all about the choreography. She has a voice, but it's not about the voice, the looks, the vibes, the energy. She's a Janet daughter, not a Madonna daughter. Find me in the comments. Britney sold over 10 million copies of her debut album in the US alone. She went to #1 in virtually every market. But the real disruption wasn't commercial, it was philosophical. For the entire decade, the pop landscape had been built on the idea that talent was the barrier to entry. You needed the voice, or the songwriting, or the artistic vision. Britney proved you needed none of those things if you had the moment. And I mean no disrespect by that. The moment was everything. My final 2 picks, 1998, Madonna. Ray of Light redefines what a pop career can be. 4 Grammys, 16 million copies sold. The most critically acclaimed album of her entire catalog. She earns this year on impact alone. 1999, Britney Spears. The debut album goes diamond. Baby One More Time is the #1 song and the #1 cultural moment of the entire year. The 90s end the moment she arrives. Which brings us to the only question that matters. Who won the decade? Let's count the years. Mariah Carey, 1990, 91, 94, 95, 97. 5 years out of 10. Whitney took 1, Janet took 1, Celine took 1, Madonna took 1, Britney took 1. 5 different artists shared the other 5 years between them. Mariah took half the decade alone. But it's not just the number, it's the spread. She won years in the vocal arms race. She could outsing anyone back then. She won years in the global expansion. She could outsell anyone on every continent. And I mean every continent, not just the ones convenient to the argument. And she was still evolving, still taking creative risks with Butterfly when artists who'd been her equals in 1992 were either treading water or disappearing entirely. The main pop girl of the 1990s is Mariah Carey, and it's not particularly close. She's the only artist on this list who is a dominant force in all 3 eras of the decade. She didn't just survive the rule changes, she anticipated them. Music Box went global before the global expansion fully arrived. Butterfly embraced hip-hop before the pop R&B crossover became the industry default. She was consistently one step ahead of where the genre was heading, and she did it while maintaining a level of commercial dominance that nobody, not Whitney, not Celine, not Madonna, could sustain for as long as she did. 5 years, 3 eras, 1 artist. But here's the thing about winning the 90s. The decade didn't end neatly. It didn't hand Mariah a trophy and send her into the 2000s with a clean slate, because the woman who won 1999, the one who tore down the vocal diva architecture in a single calendar year, she didn't just change the rules. She built a completely new game. And in that new game, the things that made Mariah untouchable for 5 years, the voice, the songwriting, the artistic evolution, suddenly mattered less than they ever had before. The queen of the 90s planted the seeds of her own dethroning, and she didn't even know it yet. The 3 eras of the 90s didn't just define a decade. They built the operating system that pop music had been running on ever since. And the fingerprints of each era are still visible today, sometimes in obvious ways, sometimes in places you wouldn't think to look. Start with the vocal arms race, because its impact might be the most misunderstood. The conventional wisdom is that Britney killed the vocal diva era in '99, and in commercial terms, that's roughly true. The 2000s weren't going to reward a 5-octave vocal range the way the early 90s did. But the influence of that era didn't disappear. It went underground and resurfaced in a completely different context. Every singing competition that dominated television in the 2000s, Pop Idol, The X Factor, American Idol, was built entirely on the values of the vocal arms race. Can you hit the note? Can you carry the ballad? Can you stand on a stage with nothing but a microphone and make people feel something? Simon Cowell didn't invent that framework. Mariah and Whitney did. The irony is extraordinary. The era that supposedly ended in 1999 became the foundational logic of the biggest entertainment format of the following decade. The battleground just moved from the recording studio to Saturday night television. And the artists who came out of those competitions, Kelly Clarkson, Leona Lewis, Jennifer Hudson, Carrie Underwood, they weren't modeling themselves on Britney. They were modeling themselves on Whitney and Mariah. The vocal arms race didn't end. It just found a new delivery mechanism. The global expansion era had an even more structural legacy. The mid-1990s proved that an artist could sell 30, 40 million copies of a single album if they treated the international market as a primary target rather than an afterthought. And the record labels learned that lesson permanently. By the early 2000s, global rollout strategies were standard. Release dates were coordinated across territories. International radio promotion became as important as domestic. Celine Dion didn't just sell records globally, she forced the entire industry to think globally. And that infrastructure is the reason an artist like Rihanna could go #1 in 20 countries simultaneously a decade later. The pipeline existed because the 90s built it. But the most significant ripple, the one that's still shaping pop music right now, came from the changing of the guard. What Britney proved in 1999 wasn't just that pop music could survive without a dominant vocal. She proved that the artist, as a concept, as a brand, as a visual and cultural identity, was the product. Not the album, not the single, the person. And that philosophical shift detonated across the 2000s. Like a shockwave, Christina Aguilera rebuilt herself as a visual provocateur with Stripped. Beyoncé understood from day one of her solo career that the image and the narrative were as important as the music. Lady Gaga arrived in 2008 and took the Britney model, artist as spectacle, as living performance art, and pushed it further than anyone thought possible. And Mariah, the queen of the 90s, walked into this new landscape and hit a wall. Glitter in 2001 wasn't a bad album. It was a collision between 90s logic and 2000s reality. Mariah was still operating on the assumption that the voice and the songwriting would carry her through. And in the world Britney had built, that assumption was no longer safe. It took her 4 years to recalibrate. Years of public ridicule, label disputes, and career obituaries before the emancipation of Mimi in 2005 proved she could adapt to the new rules without abandoning what made her special. And that, honestly, might be the most remarkable thing about Mariah Carey's career. Not that she dominated the 90s, though she did comprehensively, but that the same qualities that made her dominant in one decade nearly destroyed her in the next. And she survived it anyway. The 90s rewarded her voice, her songwriting, her instinct for evolution. The 2000s punished her for all three, and then eventually rewarded her again once she figured out how to package those skills inside the new framework. The 90s built the modern pop star, and the woman who won that decade spent the next 10 years learning that winning the old game doesn't protect you when someone flips the board. But the board didn't just flip once, it kept flipping, because the three-era structure of the 90s, talent, then scale, then spectacle, didn't stop repeating. The 2000s had their own version of it. Different artists, different rules, different inflection points, but the same underlying pattern. The game keeps changing, and the only artists who survive are the ones that change with it. So what does the 90s actually tell us about pop music? It tells us that decades aren't monoliths. We talk about 90s pop as if it were one thing, one sound, one aesthetic, one set of values. And it wasn't. It was three completely different ecosystems stacked on top of one another, each with its own logic, its own winners, and its own definition of what it meant to be the biggest pop star on the planet. The woman who won in 1990 needed a voice that could stop traffic. The woman who won in 1996 needed a passport and 32 million sales receipts. The woman who won in 1999 needed a school uniform and a music video that would burn itself into the memory of every teenager on Earth. Same decade, completely different games. And Mariah Carey is the answer to this decade for one reason above all others. She's the only artist who understood that the game was changing and changed with it. Not once, but twice. She won the vocal arms race on pure ability. She won the global expansion by making records that connected with people in villages in the north of England. And she was still evolving, still pushing into hip-hop, still refusing to repeat herself. 5 years as main pop girl, 3 different eras, one artist. And to truly understand how Mariah, Madonna, Celine, and Janet won these distinct eras, you have to look at the microscopic details inside the albums that built them. The shift from Music Box to Daydream, the absolute rebellion of Janet, and the quiet, calculated genius of Bedtime Stories and Ray of Light hold the actual blueprints for how the modern pop machine operates. I've ripped open the data, the studio decisions, and the cultural impact behind every single one of these defining records to show you exactly how the 90s were conquered album by album. The full archive of how the vocal divas fought this war is waiting for you right here.